talk about that today. We're gonna talk about listing agents and these changes and what you need to be looking for. Okay. We have about 107. Should we go ahead and get started? Okay, great. I don't want to keep y'all any longer. And so, again, as I'm going through this, just be mindful that there are processes and steps that we have to follow. That's why we're kind of doing it in this session. We're going to talk about listing agents functions today. And then Mitch, is it August 14th?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So August 14th, we rescheduled the second part, and that's going to be before the deadline of the 17th for the buyer agent part. We want to get both of those in before the actual requirements and changes. Okay. So today what we're going to do is we are going to go through the listing agents part. And I am going to tell you that everybody thinks this is so simple. You get confirmation from reading everything. NAR has changed their published guidelines since they published them a few months ago. I know I combed through NAR statements, and then their HAR has their interpretation of the settlement as well. So kind of stay posted to your association and the information that they have on that. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about keeping your explanations to your sellers pretty simple. We're going to review the listing agreement in the 3 critical paragraphs where something new has been added. And then I'm going to give you examples of how you might complete each one of them. Then we're going to get to the new amendment that is Texas Realtors created. They didn't put it out the same day on 6/24, but it answers all of NAR's requirements on the settlement. We're going to talk about the listing amendment, when you might have to use it. I'm going to show you a checklist and a little chart. And then we're going to talk about the listing agent's preparation for August 17th, right? On something like that. Real quickly, I just want to let you know that Texas Realtors Broker Lawyer Committee met a week ago, last Friday. And I always give you updates. And I want to thank all the agents in your operation that actually sent in comments to the Broker Lawyer Committee of TREC. On one of them, they are putting it into a conversational. In other words, they didn't comment on it at that time, but they did add it to the items that they are going to be considering. So that kudos to Catherine for doing that. I am going to tell you that they spent a lot of time determining if they were going to take what the working group that they appointed in April to look into, well, do we want to create an addendum, right? Texas Realtors gave them the addendum they created, the addendum regarding brokers' fees. And they decided they're going to wait and see. Okay. Now they are going to change paragraph 12 of the contract. And I want to show that just to you just briefly, okay? Hold on, let me see if I can get it. I've got so many documents for our training today. What they've done is they've inserted a verification and definition of buyer's expenses, okay? And that ties in to the buyer's brokerage fee, what the buyer's expenses would be if they've agreed to pay for the buyer brokerage compensation. So they are considering the changes then in 12A1B and 12A1A, which is the seller's expense. They've added that provision as well. So there are some changes coming, nothing now. In fact, TREC's the commissioners and chairperson, they don't meet until August 19th. And the TREC Broker Lawyer Committee is trying to refine everything that they had discussed on that all day long meeting. And then they are going to send it forward to TREC. If TREC says they love it, they're going to post it, comment, say time will be done. The Trade Broker Lawyer Committee looks at all the comments in October, and then maybe there will be changes approved in November. So once we get back past this deadline, I'll be showing you some of the changes as I did in January. Many of those changes are still going forward per the recommendation of the Broker Lawyer Committee, but we'll get into a little bit more detail on that later. Now, here is, keeping it simple for your sellers. I'm just going to tell you that what are you allowed to convey to your sellers regarding compensation? They talked a whole lot about the buyer written agreement and these type of things, but for NAR, Articles 2 and 12 of NAR's Code of Ethics apply equally to brokers working with sellers. And the first one is the listing broker should explain to our client the benefits and cost of the various types of marketing that can be done for listing and how potential buyers might respond to such marketing, including any buyer costs that the listing broker or seller may offer to pay. Okay, so it gives you permission to do that. The next thing it says is a listing broker should inform the seller about costs the buyer will incur, how the buyer might react to those costs, and how the seller can market a house considering the buyer's cost. But a listing broker must not tell a seller that a broker will steer buyers based on the amount that compensation broker is compensated. Okay, so that's just a little bit from NAR's perspective about what you can discuss with your sellers regarding compensation. I know in the very beginning when we talked all about this, there were several listing agents that really provided really good comments regarding the benefits. That's their job as a listing agent to talk about their benefits. The only thing you're going to be not telling your seller is they're not going to get any offers, right? That's the bottom line, is you're not going to say, well, because you're not going to offer compensation, you're not going to get any offers on something like that. So that still holds true. Okay.
Marilyn, real quick. So if you on a listing presentation, if a seller says, if I don't offer anything, or if I offer only 1%, will that hinder me in any way with buyers coming to see my listing? How would we answer that?
You're going to say, I don't know. We haven't faced that yet.
Okay.
We'll know.
We'll know.
After we have some data to support that on your listing that you've got.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, but sellers do have to know, they know their estimated net sheets, right? We know that, but they also do, like they're saying, they need to know what the cost the buyer is going to incur. And a lot of it is in all of it's in the contract. But in our contract right now that hasn't been changed by track, 12A1B is very open. It's not defined well about buyers' expenses on that type of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to get to the first thing and talk about the compensation in our listing agreement, okay? And we're going to look through some examples. Now, this is what paragraph 5 looks like in our new listing agreement, okay? Believe it or not, I have seen in some compliance that apparently paragraph 5 is confusing to the listing agent. So we want to try and reach a real simple, clear fashion. The broker compensation disclosure is going to be required everywhere. It's not on readily noticeable in our previous listing agreements dated before 6/24, but it tells that it's totally negotiable and it's independent of each broker decides on their own. And it says complete either 5A or 5B. So you'll never complete 5A and 5B, never. It's either 5A or 5B, okay? So we're going to look at the example for 5A. How would I complete 5A as a listing agent and review it with them? So on this one, I have given an example of what the seller that we negotiated with says, I do give you permission, listing agent broker, to what? To compensate the other broker, right? Okay, that's what the seller is giving permission in 5A. And so 5A1 is completed because the seller has to know what? They have to know the amount, right? Because 5A1A is all the listing broker's compensation. It also includes compensation in the event there is another broker on the transaction, right? So 5A1A was completed with a percentage. That's what they're going to negotiate with the seller, right? And they are going to compensate the other broker as indicated. Now 5A2 says to the seller, of that amount I put in 5A1, I'm going to show you how I will share it with the other broker. And so A2A is if the other broker represents the buyer blank percent of the sales price. And then I put in A's in 2B because we don't do sub-agency at all, right? And so there's NAs in those fields. But we're telling the seller, this is what you agreed upon. This is how I will cooperate with the other broker, right? That's what the seller is acknowledging. Now, if this seller has agreed to intermediary, the intermediary is the broker only. And so the broker's going to look here at their agreement, and they're going to convey to their buyer agent who's representing the buyer under a buyer tenant agreement and is interested in the property that's held with a listing agreement by the broker, what they will compensate. It's the same thing that we always have had traditionally. Whatever was posted in MLS was offered to the buyer agent in intermediary transactions. So this is the same position that we would be in if it were posted in MLS. Any questions? Okay, pretty straightforward. It's the amount of compensation, and then 5A2 is what you will give to the other broker. Yes.
Marilyn, can you give us an example of what would go into A1B?
Well, there could be a provision if there is no other buyer agent on the transaction. Could be something like that. Truthfully, the only time we probably would use that is if we want clear instructions and the seller to acknowledge if it's going to deviate, like a variable rate. Remember in MLS, they have variable rate compensation, at least they do now, and that's going to go away because they're not going to have compensation. What variable rate was that the listing broker is competing with all other buyers, because they're saying, if I'm the only agent in the transaction, listing agent, and there is a customer in the transaction, that rate will be this. Any other questions?
I have one. To me, I'm sorry, this is Dilsey. To me, I was thinking B might be like for those sellers who are trying to be close or pay small amount, and so maybe that amount might be the dollar amount. Or am I misunderstanding? As opposed to a percentage, maybe they're only going to give you $5,000 to list their property and share with the other broker.
That's going to be over here in the field in 5A1A.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a certain percent of the sales price or a dollar amount.
Yes. Okay. All right.
And then if that were the case, if it wasn't a percentage here and it was a flat dollar amount, then in A2, it would be the second field, and it says a dollar amount that you would share with the other brokerage.
Maryland,
Mhm.
this is Arash. For those listings that we have on MLS now, so by August 17, HR will remove the compensation part on our listings. So in case if there was a buyer negotiating before, but they didn't decide to proceed to submit an offer, and suddenly the day after these changes happen, they decide to submit an offer. If the agent reach out to us and say that, hey, I saw on MLS before 3%, and you have to honor that, is that correct, or we have to
No,
just?
it is not correct.
Right.
As of August 17th, there is no compensation. None. It all has to be negotiated by a buyer agent.
Gotcha.
Okay, any more questions on 5A? Okay, so now we're going to look at the or. Remember, it's either 5A or 5B, but not 5A and 5B. So 5B says broker's fee without compensation for other broker. That means your seller is not giving you permission to communicate that you are going to cooperate with other brokers. This is just going to be all your compensation only. They're not allowing you to cooperate with compensation for another broker. So B1A was completed with a percentage. Now here's what happens. This is an example of your seller negotiating with you and agreeing that they will not allow you to compensate the other broker, but the broker is the listing broker. And when they're intermediary, they have a signed listing agreement with the sellers allowing intermediary and a signed buyer tenant agreement with a broker being an intermediary. Okay. So in the event this seller agrees to intermediary, you would have to define what percentage listing agent will get and what percentage a buyer's agent will get. Because otherwise, the broker is going to look at their own agreement and split it unless you define it. Now, is it necessary for you to split it? No, not if you are understanding whatever you get in B1A is going to be split if there's another buyer agent under your brokerage that represents the buyer. But if it's going to be different than just being split, then you would notate it here. And again, this is the example with intermediary. This seller said, I don't want you to cooperate with other brokers, but I will allow intermediary. Any questions?
Marilyn, how reasonable is it to do amendments to this document?
To the listing agreement?
Right. There were some people that were saying, the seller says, I got a full price offer, I'm willing to pay the buyer agent now. Can we amend it still? Will that be acceptable?
Absolutely. Before they execute the contract, that the listing agreement should be amended. You just don't want to do it afterwards, right? Everything kind of in the right order so that the seller is agreeing to those provisions before they sign a contract.
Quick question.
Marilyn,
This
Uh-huh.
in A, if we have a customer, can we no longer keep the full amount then? If it says
that's
it's going to.
Yeah, everything in BA or 5A is all the brokers.
Okay.
question. This is Lan. How are you, Marilyn?
Just fine.
So do we, as Keller Williams Memorial, have a policy for the B1B? Is the intermediary transaction listing agent 4%, buyer's agent 4%?
No, I just gave these as examples, folks. That's
Right.
all they are. They're just examples.
So we don't have a policy like that.
I'm not aware of any policy that the broker has.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Marilyn, I have a
Marilyn.
question.
Uh-huh.
This is Lisa Rigdon. I've had before where maybe a builder says, I'll pay the full 8% in your example if it has an agent on the other side, but if it's intermediary and or unrepresented, then I want to pay you only 5%. In that case, he's allowing you to give third-party brokers, but it affects the intermediary. Would you then use maybe section A in that example to, and A1B maybe?
Well, 5 would be the one, because this one says this is a broker's fee without compensation for other broker. Okay, so yeah, if it's a customer, you're gonna get everything in B1A.
Yeah, but what if
Unless
they're also allowing, but they're also allowing if you bring in a third-party broker, a co-broke, they're willing to.
And that won't apply in that paragraph. This paragraph is only for cooperation with where there is no cooperation with another broker.
Right. And so I'm saying, what if they what I've seen,
Pardon me?
what I've
Lisa's,
seen,
yeah.
what I've seen before was, if you bring in a co-broke, we're willing to pay the full 8%. But if it's in-house or a customer, we only want to pay 5%, like as an example. Would you just put that all up in A? Or that's why this is confusing a little bit, I think, to a lot of us.
5A is only compensation with other brokers.
Okay.
Okay. So if your seller says, I will never allow you to cooperate with other brokers, you will use B.
Okay.
And then if you needed to be more specific about unrepresented buyer, X%, right? Intermediary, listing agent this much, buyer agent this much. That's the paragraph that you would use.
Okay, Marilyn, this is Gina.
Uh-huh.
Let me get this, let me try and see if I understand this clearly. So if we have the listing at say 8%, if I also bring the buyer, where would that compensation be? So the buyer, but I don't have a buyer's rep agreement with that buyer. It's just a client, a customer.
An unrepresented buyer.
Mm-hmm.
It's
so would that be in A1B?
No. Unrepresented buyers, that's not intermediary. So anything that you have in
Correct, I know that.
B1, yeah, B1A is all the listing broker's compensation.
Marilyn, this is Patty. So in reality, what I'm hearing you say, and which we should always be doing, is we're explaining the process, both A and B. We've agreed to list, let's just say they've agreed with cooperative compensation. We've listed everything out, all the details. But in the course of the listing, an unrepresented buyer does happen to come. We would then do an amendment that would reflect the changes to a compensation and whatever fee that would have been represented in B, since we can't do A and B. We just need to amend.
If you're going to cooperate, if your seller agrees for you to cooperate with compensation for the other broker, you only use 5A.
Correct. But in the course of the listing, sometimes even though they've agreed, an unrepresented buyer comes in and they want that to happen. So at that point, are we then just saying, sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you're stuck with B1, 5A1, or are we amending to then reflect a different?
You and the seller will do an amendment to the listing to reflect what you agree upon in that instance, but you're going to tie it to that address only.
Correct.
For that transaction only. In other words, that buyer only. Because if you keep it in MLS, you could get subsequent offers. And if you reduce it just unilaterally, you might not be getting any compensation.
In that amendment, do we just add that property address or that buyer's name? How do we protect ourselves?
You would do it and say for this transaction only for buyer such and such, whatever it is.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, Marilyn.
Uh-huh.
when I speak with the seller and I tell them I'm gonna charge you 8% commission, but if an unrepresented buyer comes my way, I'm gonna charge you instead 6.5. How do I specify that on the
If we're
listing?
talking about B, where you're not, your seller hasn't agreed to any compensation with the other broker, you would put that notation in B1B. If buyer is unrepresented, broker compensation will be.
A certain amount, and can it be different than 5B1A? Can it be different than the 8%?
Yeah, that's why you're
Okay.
identifying it.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Marilyn, this is Yolanda. Can I
Uh-huh.
ask you a question? Okay, just still in same 5, either A or B.
We're in
So,
B.
yes, I'm sorry, 1 or 2, 5A. So as before, number 1 says, well, in this case, it says 100% of the sales price, correct? This is a rental. So 1 month, 100% of 1 month.
No, this is the listing for sale.
Okay. Oh, so should I wait to talk about a rental?
We're not, in the listing agreement for leases, it has similar provisions about how much you're going to receive for 1 month, or it could be a flat dollar amount, or for the amounts over the life of the lease. So yeah, it's different than the listing for sale.
Okay, my only question was, if I showed it and do I have to modify anything, or I just get the 100% as it says?
Yeah, it's the broker. See, all of
Yes,
this
okay.
information in 5A, 1A is the brokers.
Okay, it's clear. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions about broker's fee with intermediary?
Marilyn, this is Catherine.
Uh-huh.
If I have intermediary with appointed agents.
Nope.
No?
That's a lot of wallet.
Oh, that was
Somebody-
somebody.
Yeah, that's not me, hon.
If I have appointed brokers and I'm representing the listing and the buyer has an agreement with the buyer agent that they will pay their commission, how would that be working in paragraph B?
Well, paragraph B1A is all the listing broker's compensation. And there is no other broker. So you don't have anything to do with a buyer being represented by another brokerage. 5B has nothing to do with it.
Okay, so the intermediary is only for the intermediary without appointments.
Because it's not another broker. It's only the same broker.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so now I'm going to show you the example without intermediary. So in 5B, it says when earned and payable, seller will pay broker. There is no separate notation in B1B. Okay, it's just all of the listing broker's compensation. And that involves when they say there is without intermediary, that means no one representing a buyer in your brokerage could ever show this property to their buyer. If the seller hasn't agreed to intermediary, there will be no showings of any buyer represented under this brokerage.
This is Lon. I have a question. So why would it restrict a in brokerage buyer's agent? Because don't they also have their own buyer's agent contract? And therefore
it has nothing to do with that. It has that the seller has not agreed to intermediary. So either the seller agrees to intermediary, allowing buyers represented under that brokerage, your brokerage, to look at the property and provide offers. If they're not allowing any intermediary, there is never going to be a buyer shown this property by under the same brokerage.
Hi, Mary. I have a question. This is Tanya, by the way. Okay, there is a place on the MLS where actually it will show if the seller do not agree on any intermediary, or it has to be asked to the, how if I'm representing a buyer, how do I know the condition of the listing agreement between the listing agent and the seller?
You would contact the listing agent because they're the only ones that would be able. See, the listing agent, if the seller does not agree for the broker to become an intermediary, then only the listing agent can make the appointments, because every buyer agent under their brokerage has to be told that the seller is not agreeing to intermediary.
But Marilyn, isn't section 9 where it describes about intermediary? And so I think what people are confused about is that you only need to do this if he says, I'm not paying a buyer's agent, but I am going to pay within brokerage, you would do B. But in A, if you have intermediary, it doesn't matter if it's intermediary or a third party, right? Because I think that's what's confusing.
Yes, I'm just showing you paragraph B, when a seller does not agree to intermediary. An intermediary is the broker. And so the seller is saying, I don't want any buyer represented by your brokerage listing broker to see my property.
But B here's the other broker, not our broker.
No, B is without compensation for other brokers. Intermediary is paragraph 9 of the listing agreement. And I was just showing you an example. In the event the buyer, so the sellers have not agreed for the broker to become an intermediary. Before, the other example showed you how a listing agent might want to define clear for their seller, if it's an intermediary transaction, this is it, because there is no other broker when you use 5B. It's all the same broker.
Marilyn, this is Marcia. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I thank you. I have no question.
Any question about paragraph 5B, where they do not allow intermediary?
Marilyn, what I understand that you're saying is, while we have that option to add an intermediary, if we don't actually have intermediary check, that just simply wouldn't apply to us, is all you were saying.
It lets you know that if it's not intermediary, if the seller won't agree to intermediary, all of this in 5B1A is the listing brokers. They don't have to split it.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn, this is Maria Parra. So as a buyer's agent, I'm getting goosebumps. As a listing agent, are we going to get some kind of idea of how to address those unrepresented buyers? How to handle those unrepresented buyers as a listing agent?
It hasn't changed by this settlement. You still do the IABS and the representation disclosure 1417, and hopefully the wire fraud notice. I showed you the 1417 changes, the representation disclosure. It makes it real clear to the customer that they have nobody to represent them, and we're not going to give them opinions and advice.
Okay. Thank
But
you.
again, the compensation, if it's in 5A1A, is all the listing brokers, regardless if there is another broker or an unrepresented buyer.
And Marilyn, you can adjust that, right?
Pardon me?
You can adjust that should, I don't even want to think. about the situation.
Absolutely. Just do that amendment to the listing, whatever
Yep.
you and the seller negotiate, just make sure you do it before the seller ever signs a contract where it might apply.
Perfect, thank you.
Marilyn, on 5A, with compensation for other broker, it would be beneficial if they added or unrepresented buyer next to for other compensation for other broker or unrepresented buyer. Something to think about. It makes it clear that way.
Well, see, this is broker's fee with compensation for other broker. It doesn't talk about an unrepresented buyer.
But this
So what-
section applies to it though. It applies to an unrepresented buyer, correct? You
Sure.
just said it.
And,
Okay.
and 5A1A is all the listing broker's compensation with an unrepresented buyer, unless you and the seller amend the listing for this buyer transaction only.
Thank you.
Yeah, that part hasn't changed. Everything we just talked about amending and determining that the sellers maybe change their mind or you want to negotiate differently with the seller because of this one offer, that all gets done in the amendment to listing.
Marilyn, this is Joe Diasana. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes,
great.
sir.
So in general, in most circumstances, 5A would be completed as normal as today, in most circumstances. If a seller has something that's different, then we'll do the we'll do it accordingly. Now, if during the course of the transaction something changes, like for example, multiple offer, and we have 10 offers, and one is an investor, an agent who is an investor agent. They're licensed, they're broker, but they're going to get it on the back end from their buyer who's going to sell with them. So sometimes they come in at 0, right? They'll put in, we don't want any, in order to compete, we don't want to get the buyer agent compensation. At that point, then we need to do an amendment to the listing to indicate to the seller, or we don't need to, because in my mind, that would seem like, well, that's their choice, the buyer's agent's choice not to be compensated.
You have to have this compensation agreement between brokers where that broker is waiving it totally. So there's something in writing that shows there will be no compensation to the other broker. Otherwise, paragraph 5A1A is all the listing broker's compensation. If you want to change that with the seller because of the offer, you would do an amendment to listing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Marilyn, if I have a seller or a landlord who is an investor and she has many properties, so she always lists with me, and she's like, I'm not gonna pay any a buyer's agent. I'm just gonna pay your I'm just gonna pay your fee. You can put it as however you want. Normally, how would you put it? Like 5A?
It'll be in 5B.
Okay. Thank you.
And if your investor will allow the broker to be intermediary, you'll probably notate something like I have in B1B.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Adriana. What about if I mark only the part A and the offer comes from an agent for the same brokerage?
As long as the seller has agreed to intermediary in your listing agreement, anything in 5A1A will be split as in 5A2. So whatever you're going to pay the other brokers, buyer representative, you're going to pay the buyer agent and your office, unless you want to notate something differently.
Yeah, but it's the same broker.
Yes,
Okay, Marilyn.
This just says
so-
that there's 5A says seller has agreed to pay the listing broker this much and gives them permission to cooperate and compensate the other broker. But it doesn't mean there always is going to be another broker. The listing broker's compensation is all in 5A1A.
But we have to
Always
put
in
down
that case.
5A2 as well.
If you're going to cooperate with other brokers because you've used this paragraph, yes, you would have to complete 5.2.
Okay, because in
5A2.
5A2, it says if the other broker represents the buyer, but what if we're not representing the buyer? Why if the buyer is just a customer?
Right, then everything in 5A1A is
1A
the
will
listing
apply.
broker's compensation. Yeah,
Okay,
always has been that way, always will be.
okay.
Marilyn.
Oh, just kidding.
Question. Who, besides realtors, who are we allowed to share the split with? Say we have a customer that wants to offer, and depending on how much we make is what they're going to base their offer off of. Do we have to disclose that to them, or is that something we can keep to ourselves?
Well, your listing agreement is with the seller. If this buyer comes forward and wants to interfere with your listing agreement, that is only going to be between you and the seller. And we don't share compensation with anyone that's not licensed.
Gotcha.
You might make a concession, which I've seen listing agents have a concession that contribute to the buyer's expenses, but we never share compensation with anyone that's not licensed.
Thank you.
So if you're a principal to a transaction, you can, only if you're a principal to a transaction, you can give them a concession.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of your question.
If you're a principal to a transaction, you can give them a concession.
If you're a principal to the transaction, that means
So
you're
if you're
a buyer or
or
seller.
a seller in the transaction, you can give them a concession if they're not licensed, obviously. That's the only time that you would be able to give them a concession.
Yes, the seller or the listing agent can give an unrepresented buyer that's not licensed a contribution. They can provide a concession, but they never give compensation. Listing broker never shares compensation with anyone that is not licensed.
Marilyn?
Uh-huh.
At the beginning of the webinar, you spoke about the timeline on when all these changes are coming down with the forms and things like that. So November is when it's going to be finally approved. What about listings?
It might be. I don't know with Trek, you never know.
Understood. So what do we do with existing listings or a listing that I just got signed before August 17th or 18th or whatever? Do we just kind of hold tight? I'm
going to show you that in just a minute.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions about 5, A or B? Okay. So the next change in our listing as of 6/24 is in 11F. It's a new provision. And HAR created the new field July 9th that would allow a seller to give permission to the listing agent and broker to disclose that they are considering a contribution to buyer's expenses. It's not compensation. Okay. And so in 11F, the seller is going to give you permission to share information or they're not. Real straightforward. And if the seller wants to identify a further dollar amount that they want you to share with others, or in the field that's in HAR MLS, you'll use the TXR 1412, which is the seller's authorization. Any questions about 11F?
Marilyn, did I hear you say that it's not compensation?
Correct, it isn't. It's a contribution the seller may make to the buyer's expenses.
such as buyers, brokers, fees.
Correct.
Why would a seller want to make a contribution versus a compensation?
I have no idea.
Exactly.
So it's
like if a person, I'm sorry, like like if a person is needing help with closing costs, isn't that what this is applying to?
correct. And it's about disclosing prior to an offer being made. In other words, this is giving the listing agent permission to disclose to others that the seller is considering contributing an amount towards the buyer's expenses.
Correct.
1412 identifies a dollar amount if the seller is so inclined for the listing agent to share that dollar amount with others. But
Marilyn,
it's not compensation. It is considering a contribution towards the buyer's expenses only. Yes.
just to clarify, this has nothing to do with section 5 that we just discussed.
Correct.
Okay.
You're right. Yes, ma'am. This is a contribution to buyer's expenses. It's not about compensation.
And Marilyn, this is Joe. You're being very specific about your word choice is contribution, because if I'm thinking out loud here, if we put a dollar amount, hey, they're willing to contribute for closing costs, or they're willing to contribute for flooring, or whatever it is, that the seller is considering it, it doesn't mean that they're obligated to. It doesn't force them to say, okay, well, you said you're going to do that, but then the buyer comes in with a lowball offer at 5% below ask. The language is they are considering it, and it's a contribution, but obviously the seller has final right and executive decision on that, right?
Yeah, in this TXR 1412 that they changed specifically for this, it gives an area where the seller will give you permission to disclose what they might consider, but they are not bound by it. And it says it all in bold and everything.
Perfect.
Yeah. As I said, this is the changes that are on our listing agreement right now. And what we need to do is look at our deadlines, okay? And what I'm going to do real quickly first is show you the amendment. If you have a listing agreement, it also applies to buyer tenant agreements, signed before the version of 6/24/24, this amendment will make you compliant with the NAR settlement. Okay, so Texas Realtors created a special form for you to use. You can do this one today. You don't have to wait until August 17th, okay? A lot of agents are saying, well, if it's not under contract, I don't have to amend it. That's fine, but there's nothing that stops you from using this amendment. And this amendment, there are only 3 fill in the blanks for you. It says on or about blank, the date that you actually entered into your listing agreement or your buyer tenant agreement. In this one, the effective date as of today, signing this amendment, okay? And then the paragraph A is the broker disclosure that's required on every listing agreement and buyer tenant agreement, and is in the new ones, but not in the old ones where it was readily noticeable. It was an additional information. Paragraph B is for listing agents only. What you're just going to have to fill in paragraph 1, B1 is the actual property address. And they're just affirming that whatever the seller agreed to in the old listing agreement in 8A still works. 8B is removed because now MLS has nothing to do with other compensation to a buyer's broker. They don't have to be an MLS participant to receive it. So that's stripped from that. So those would be the only 3 fields that you would have to complete as a listing agent. You're going to sign and date it, remember to add your license number, and then get your clients to do it. And you will now comply with that part of the NAR settlement that was required as of August 17th.
I have a question, not a question, just an observation. So say you have a buyer who's buying a new construction, and there is a bonus that wasn't there
Yeah,
initially.
we're not talking about buyers today, and I'm going to do that on the 14th. And the reason for that, Dilsey, is because we really need everybody to just kind of focus on listing agents' requirements.
Not a problem.
Yeah, you can contact me afterwards and I'll answer your question regarding any question about the buyer.
Okay, it was that last paragraph of not get the bonuses that made me want to holler out and say something.
Yeah, no, we're
Prohibited
not
from
going to do
receiving
that now.
that
No.
extra, yeah, that's the one that caught my attention. Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing about that right now. And there's no
Okay.
bonus that has been mentioned in any listing agreement or anything at this point in time.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So again, this form is the 2701. You can use it today on any of your listing agreements that you had prior to the version of 62424.
Hi, Marilyn. I
Hi.
have a question on that. Once we amend, if we amend before the deadline,
Mhm.
do we need to change our commission split or percentage on the MLS?
No, it has nothing to do with compensation. This form will take you and make you compliant for your old listing agreements because the NAR settlement says August 17th, we're stripping compensation out of MLS.
Okay, so well, I don't need to change it on the MLS. Just leave it
No,
as-
they're going to take care of that for you. They're going to remove it for you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, so the amendment to the representation agreement, as I said, that's one of the ones that you can use today, but you absolutely have to have it by August 17th, because if you're not under contract by August 16th, you've got to do certain things. So now we're going to look at the checklist for what you're going to have to do. And this is for listing agents now or to comply with the deadline of 8/17. You can use it now if you want, or it could apply to your listing that you did prior to 6/24 where you offered no compensation, right? Just depends. And so you're only going to use this Texas Realtors 2701, the one I just showed you, on the old agreements. You don't have to do anything if you have a listing on the new agreement dated 6/24. Okay. And again, I showed you the 3 areas as a listing agent that you would have to make any notation. Now, the only other thing you might have to do as of August 17th, if you're not under contract, is do an amendment to the listing. And why would that be? If your listing is not under contract on August 17th, compensation has gone away in MLS. And you could not tell a buyer agent who calls and says, will you cooperate and compensate buyer's brokerage fees? You couldn't say it unless you had permission from your sellers. Because our old agreements gave us permission because we put it in MLS, right? But when it's stripped, it's no longer in MLS, and you have to have a written permission from your sellers to be able to tell a buyer agent representative if there's any compensation that you will share. So there could be an instance where you'll use the 2701, which Texas Realtors created for you, and then an amendment to the listing giving you permission to disseminate information regarding buyer brokerage compensation. I'm going to show you the 1412 again, because what I did is I added the 1412 example in the authorization in B. What's highlighted here in yellow, this is what the sellers are giving you permission to disseminate the information. When it goes away in MLS, you would have to have this authorization. Otherwise, you couldn't communicate that to a buyer agent representative.
Okay, Marilyn, and what's that form number that you're talking about now that we
Right
see?
now, 1412.
1412. So bottom line, we need that. For
Um,
any
you-
existing listing that I have right now, he's gonna do the 2701 and the 1412.
You can, otherwise you're going to use the amendment. Okay, and I'll show you the amendment that you could use as an option too.
But wouldn't I need the amendment to even add the seller authorization to disclose and advertise to my listing agreement?
Yeah,
Under the
as it can be,
either
you
way,
can
right?
either, yeah, you can either add it to the listing amendment or you can attach the 1412. And what I provided you as an example is what you would add to the 1412. Now I'm going to show you the 1404 amendment. Okay. And this amendment is identifying that permission that if you have not got your listing under contract on August 17th, you could do an amendment as I just the 1412, or you can seller gives authorization, that same information that's in 11D4 of the new listing agreement. So you have different ways you can do it. You can do the 1412 or you can do the amendment.
Number?
The amendment?
Number, that you just talked about?
1404 is the amendment.
1404.
Mhm.
Okay. And that takes care of both.
If you do both of those, you can use the 1412 or you can use the 1404.
All right. Thank you.
Now, what is optional for you? Remember what we had checked in the new listing agreements in 11F? So if your seller, when you got that new field in MLS, you probably went and had a conversation with your sellers. This is what you should do. And if your seller wants to disclose a dollar amount, they might consider as a contribution to buyer's expenses, then you would use the 1412, but that's optional. No seller is forced to do that, but you as a listing agent won't mention one word if your seller would consider a contribution to buyer's expenses unless you have something in writing from the seller authorizing that. So the deadline, you can do the 2701 right now today. Then if you're not under contract by August 17th, you could do the amendment to the listing where the sellers are giving you permission to convey the other broker compensation that they would allow you to say to a buyer agent representative. Or you can do the 1412 with the information that I have included. Any questions about what you're supposed to do by the deadline?
Marilyn, that form that you talked about where the seller discloses the dollar amount that they might consider contributing, and that also
1412.
1412. Would you upload that in the documents in MLS?
No, you can't do anything about compensation in MLS. This is about, you're talking about the contribution. Yeah, you can do that. I think it would be better, you don't upload these documents. These are really our listing agreement documents with our sellers. You just use the field that they have in MLS.
Okay, thanks.
Any questions? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what the listing agent preparation, right? You've got to be thinking about certain things, right? Okay, so preparing for inquiries from other brokers about compensation. Remember, per TREC rules, you have to respond within 2 days, and your seller would want you to respond what? Immediately, probably, quite quickly, because they don't want to miss out on any offer from a buyer. What you cannot do is you cannot provide any link in MLS, in agent remarks, hidden smoke signals and various other things regarding compensation. Can't upload any document in MLS if it has anything about compensation. You can't do that, okay?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
What happens when the sellers ask me, what is the typical commission that I will, or compensation that I will pay to the buyer's agent? Because we can ask, especially if we want them to pay, you know, or tell them, hey, we have this, you have the option to pay the buyer's agent compensation. And when they say, okay, what's the typical, or what do I pay them? Because they will ask that even though we can't say anything.
Okay, here's the deal. You can convey what is normal and that you've seen in the past, but you are not going to ever strong arm them into believing that they have to do that. Okay, so be very careful about that. You have data, right? The problem is with the MLS rules changing, you're not allowed to say, I have to do this, or you sellers have to do this. That is not true. You just negotiate.
Correct. Thank
And
you.
you can give your opinions about compensation. And again, as I showed you on the slide earlier from NAR, it was real clear that NAR says that you probably need to communicate to the sellers real clearly what are buyers going to consider when making an offer on your property. What are the expenses buyers have, right? And if they're represented, they had to have signed a buyer tenant agreement, so they owe the buyer brokerage compensation. Okay, so again, does somebody have a question? So listing agents, you have to be prepared for this. If you've got a lot of listings, you're going to have to work out a methodology about how you would. Could you have something on your voice message about where they could go to find out that compensation that you've got posted that's not a part of MLS and is not a part of a download direct or indirect data feed from MLS data? It could be who to contact, to send an email to get the confirmation on some information about that. Whatever you're going to have to do, but you're going to have to think about it, because as of August 17th, there is no compensation to the other brokerage. There is no cooperation. So they will have to know this information representing a buyer. Their fiduciary duty is to know this and to try.
Hey, Marilyn, can I cut in here just real quick to remind everybody that we have a website set up specifically for you to showcase the compensation. It is not tied at all to the MLS. There's no linking back and forth like Marilyn said with the MLS, but we have a website that's been ready to go now for about 2 months. We got aggressive with this. We jumped on it. So we're going to forward to everybody in the office that site. And so you can have people go to the site, but again, there's no affiliation between that and MLS. Yes, Michael Knowles. All right, so the question that Michael Knowles so diligently asked was, who's going to put it in? In the early stages, you will, but I'm going to have somebody that we're going to have somebody in the Philippines that'll do this. You're going to shoot it to them and they'll load up everything for you that needs to go in there. But in the embryonic stage, I just wanted to whip that cool term out. In the embryonic stage, we're going to have you guys key in your compensation.
And Michael, it's not a lot of detail, is it?
Well, no, it's 123 Main Street, and here's what we're paying.
There you go.
Yeah. All
Wonderful.
right, back to the show.
Great.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Knowing that you can put an amount that sellers are willing to consider offering towards buyers' cost, isn't it much easier to just have the sellers do that versus us going through cooperative compensation outside of not published on MLS? Because this you can put in MLS and people can see it. So you don't have to deal with that whole, now I got to go somewhere else to find that compensation.
Well, here's the tricky part on that. They've already determined that it would be a violation of the settlement agreement if you put in the amount that might be considered a customary buyer's brokerage expense in the contribution to buyer's expenses. It's really, and it's not contingent, it's not a guarantee or anything like that. It's just, this is what the seller may consider contributing to buyer's expenses.
So Marilyn, so when, as a buyer's agent and we're approaching different sellers and I have a tour of 8 homes that I need to take my buyer around, is it binding if the listing agent sells it, texts me back, hey, this is what we're offering in terms of buyer agent compensation? Is that, is a text binding, is an email binding?
No.
That kind of thing?
No,
Okay.
absolutely not. Compensation agreements will have to be signed. And I'm going to take you through what this listing agent preparation is all about. So if you have not been requested for information regarding compensation as a listing agent, you may receive the 2402. This is what Joe was just making a reference. And just remember, this is the compensation agreement between brokers. This form would have to be signed and is binding prior to a buyer agent to offer. And I'm going to show you the form real quick. Compensation agreement between brokers. It's only 1 page. And so as a listing agent, if all of a sudden you get this form from a prospective buyer agent that they want to register their client and get compensation from you, this form would have to be totally signed and executed by all parties. It is binding before the contract offer was even done by the buyer agent.
Marilyn, I have a question. Why did the Texas Realtors decide that this needs to be done before? Because I can contemplate that maybe it's going to change based on the offer. I've heard several people say that, and I can imagine that's going to be the case. Why wouldn't it just be part of the offer?
Well, we have the addendum regarding broker's fee that we'll go through. But this is the compensation if the buyer agent is going to receive compensation from the listing broker. And nothing in the contract, they've stripped out broker's fees, is not in the part of the contract based upon what TREC is considering. So again, you don't have compensation as of August 17th at all. So a buyer's agent is going to secure everything that they have in writing with a buyer listing agent if they are going to seek compensation from the listing broker.
Marilyn.
Hey, Marilyn.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll go next.
So Marilyn, could we use this, have it pre-signed by our seller, and use this as a way to,
The seller doesn't sign this one, Joe. This is agreement between brokers. This is where the buyer agent is asking the listing broker to pay them.
Right. But we could communicate that out as far as, hey, you're going to see this house. Here's a compensation agreement. Or is that dangerous to do?
You can't post it up in MLS, but if you know when an agent is making a showing appointment for your listing, right? You could fill most of this out, and you won't sign it, but you could send it over to them for them to sign and send back to you, and you would ultimately sign it and agree to it.
Okay.
You just can't post it up in MLS or have it attached as a link for anything that does the direct or indirect feed from MLS data.
Right. I just want to find a way to easily communicate it where it's efficient for, communicating with all potential buyer brokers.
Yeah, Yeah, and you can, as I said, once you know you've got an appointment, you could send it out to them.
And Marilyn, that goes the opposite way too. So the buyer agent can send it to the listing broker, fill it out and send it to them.
That's usually who's going to send it, because they're going to want to make sure
Yeah.
they've secured compensation per their
Okay.
requirements with the buyer.
Okay, thank you.
Marilyn,
Uh-huh.
on this form, does it separate this as being only in regards to yes, we're offering versus the actual offer itself? Like someone had mentioned earlier, a lot of the times they're going to be, the seller may say, yes, we're willing to offer, but if the offer comes in and the terms are not favorable, then that might be something that's negotiated differently.
If 5A is marked in the listing agreement, this form can be used by the listing agent and the buyer agent. 5A says that I give you permission to cooperate. It doesn't change it. And if your seller doesn't want to cooperate with the other broker, then you would use 5B. But if you use 5A, you know exactly what the breakout is for the other broker's compensation.
But can still be negotiated, correct?
Well, you wouldn't use this form if your seller wants to negotiate, and they're not going to get an offer unless they have reached some type of an agreement on something like that.
Okay, might have more questions later, but continue. Thank you so much.
Okie doke. So listing agents, you didn't respond to the request, right? It was timely, and the buyer says to the buyer agent, put that offer in now. I'll negotiate with the seller. The addendum regarding broker's fees will be on every offer as of August 17th, or any offer now if there is no compensation for buyer brokerage fees, except with a farm and ranch contract. And if your buyer is going to pay your compensation and they're not going to ask for another source, okay, or intermediary. We don't need to use it for intermediary, okay, because this is about other brokers' fees, and there is no other broker and intermediary. So what happens, listing agents, is the buyer was saying, I'm not going to wait for you to get an agreement. I'm going to negotiate directly with the seller. Can they do that?
No.
Absolutely, they can. And so the NAR settlement does not preclude a buyer from not negotiating for buyer's expenses and compensation directly with the seller. And this is the form that Texas Realtors created for us to do that. So you haven't gotten the compensation agreement between brokers, listing agent, but you get an offer. And on the offer is this addendum regarding broker's fees. And they go through this and fill it out, and they don't mark D1, but they mark D2B. And it says X% of the sales price towards other brokers' fees. No, they use this option only if there's no separate written compensation agreement between seller and other broker. So the buyer says, I'll negotiate it with the seller. And if they use D2B, that creates a new obligation to seller. So listing agents, well, here's what I'm going to tell you. If you had 5A completed in your listing agreement, you didn't get back to the buyer agent regarding the compensation between brokers, right? You probably will not have your sellers agree to this because you already have it in your listing agreement, right? So what you're going to do is do the compensation agreement between brokers, get that signed, and tell the buyer agent to resubmit the offer accordingly, right? That's what you'll do. If your seller signs this, they will be obligated to any amount the buyer negotiated with the seller in D2B for other brokers' fees. This is not about contributions to buyer's expenses. This is where the buyer is negotiating directly with the seller. I want you to pay this.
Is that in addition to the 5A? Because if we accidentally have the seller sign this, but they also sign a 5A, it almost sounds like it's in addition to.
Well, no, see, here, that's why I said, if you are a listing agent and you have 5A in your listing agreement, you're never going to allow your seller to agree to D2B unless it could be additional compensation, you know, that the buyer is negotiating. But bottom line is, you either have a 2402 with the agreement between brokers as a listing agent, or you're not going to most likely allow a buyer to negotiate directly. Your seller is going to have to know, look, in my agreement, I agreed to this. That's what you're going to have in in D1, because it correlates with what was in the listing agreement in 5A. So listing agents, be prepared. There's going to be some buyer's agents that are not going to get the compensation agreement between brokers, the 2402 done right beforehand, right? They're just going to say, the buyer now wants to negotiate directly to the seller to get a certain amount towards other brokers' fees. So you have to be kind of careful as a listing agent. Make sure you absolutely follow what's in your listing agreement or what your seller may consider amending the listing agreement to be for. Because if your seller agrees to D2B, they are going to pay the other broker's fees.
Quick question, this is Lan. So if we do send the broker's agreement on compensation and they come back with, oh, we never got it, so here's the buyers agree they do this D2B, then what do you say? I've already sent it out. Here's
saying you're going to go back to the listing agent's going to go back to the buyer's agent, and you're going to say, I, as the listing broker, I've been given permission to cooperate and compensate the other broker. We need to get the 2402 completed and signed, and then you need to amend your addendum regarding broker's fee to reflect that.
Thank you.
And
Marilyn, it seems like there's two opportunities where we can send out the 2402, either maybe through the website that Michael's talking about, where they show the listing, the compensation, and here's the agreement, so they can download it themselves. Or is it true that we cannot send it through Showing Smart? Because we can set up all the instructions on access. Maybe we can send a link to a signed document through that, or is it Showing Smart considered the MLS?
I don't think it is. I think they're an independent third-party provider, and as long as they don't have a direct or indirect feed from MLS, that might be a consideration.
They do have a direct feed from the MLS, and it's run by HAR.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Marilyn, do I understand that this form is going to be filled out either D1 or D2? You're either going to do 2402 and you're going to check that, or you're going to do number 2 if it's not done. So if you're going to probably receive this form no matter what. It's just whether or not 1 or 2 is checked.
As of August 17th, or if there's no compensation in MLS now. Yeah, this form would have to be on every offer. Otherwise, the buyer is not negotiating for the other broker's fees, their own broker's fees.
Marilyn?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, under the other broker's fees under D, let's see, because sometimes we had a separate blank if it was you pay 6%, or if the other side was unrepresented, we would do a different percentage. How do you do that? Can you still do that on here?
Unrepresented buyer is not going to get any compensation for broker's fees.
Okay, because this is just broker's fees. I'm just thinking in the listing contract part itself.
Everything in 5A is all the listing broker's compensation, and everything in 5B is all the listing broker's compensation.
Okay.
Marilyn,
I'm sorry, Ty, go ahead.
Thanks, Kay. For the buyer, if the buyer decides to negotiate directly with the seller and they have already signed a buyer's agreement for 3%, for example, with you representing them, if they were to negotiate only 2% with the seller, so now they still have to pay the difference of that 1%, or does this D2B override the buyer's representation agreement?
Oh, absolutely not. The buyer's representation agreement is real clear.
Okay.
It's whatever the percentage is that the buyer is going to have to pay the buyer's broker. And so it's real clear in the buyer tenant agreement. If it changes, then you'll amend it. And we'll talk about that the next time when we talk about buyers.
Got you. Thank you.
I'm just trying to show you what you're going to get as a listing agent when you don't have a signed compensation agreement between brokers. I just know this is going to happen to you listing agents because buyers are not going to wait for you to respond to their buyer agent.
But Marilyn, if we have 2402 signed, then this is not needed, right? This just seems redundant if you have 2402.
You are going to do this. It has to be clear among all parties. This will be done if there is no compensation in MLS as of August 17th. This addendum will be on the contract. The only times it won't is if there's a farm and ranch contract and if your buyer is going to pay your compensation.
Marilyn, I have a question. So if I have a listing and I receive the compensation agreement from a buyer's, another agent, and my seller is not paying any commission to them, where would I put 0? Or how would I document that there will not be paying any type of commission?
You don't have to worry about it because if you don't have a signed buyer compensation agreement between brokers, there is no compensation to the other broker.
But to let them know, so I just let them know, okay, my seller's not paying anything, and I just don't sign this, don't send it back.
Oh, you're talking about the buyers negotiating directly to the seller?
No, let's say I'm a listing agent. I received this form.
If there's no compensation, there is no signed 2402.
Okay, so I just let them know we're not paying anything, and that's it.
You're going to say as a listing broker, I am not going to provide any compensation to your buyer brokerage fees.
So it doesn't have to be documented that we're not.
No.
Okay.
It's at risk for the buyer agent, right? Truthfully, and the buyer. That's why they created this addendum. So it's real clear. Either they've got a 2402 sign between the brokers, or they've got a for sale by owner and a 2401, right? Or this buyer is going to negotiate directly with the seller for them to give a amount towards their other broker's fees.
Marilyn, what's the number, please, of this form?
2406.
Okay, so again, the 2402 is before the offer, and then with any offer as a listing agent that we receive, we're looking for the 2406 with every offer.
If, again, as I said, if it's not a farm and ranch contract or the buyer agents receiving their compensation only from their buyer.
Okay, thank you.
So Marilyn, when we're setting up a tour of 8 homes, it probably would be wise for us to ask for the 2402 up front before showing the houses, right?
Right. That's what a lot of the agents in the training that I've done, a lot of them are saying, look, my buyer and I discussed this, and the buyer put in my buyer tenant agreement. They want me to secure these for all the properties they're interested in. Again, remember the NAR settlement hinges on transparency, clear, nothing open-ended, nothing to be determined. Everything has to be very specific. But I know the reality of how these offers are going to come in. A listing agent, you know, they had 5 showings this morning on their listing, right? And they're not going to be able to respond to every one of those showing permission to show, and they're not going to be sending out the compensation agreement. But I know how buyers agents are. Their buyers are going to say, I'm not going to wait for this. I'm going to get it from the seller. And so this addendum accomplishes that for a buyer. Again, if you're a listing agent and you have compensation in 5A for the other broker, you're going to say, whoa, let's go back and get this done the right way. And then you're going to send them an invitation to resubmit, giving the proper information that could complete the addendum regarding broker fees. You just don't want your seller to be sideswiped by this type of thing. So there's just, as I said, I just know how buyers agents and buyers are going to be.
I have a question
Uh-huh.
based on that. Can I send a photograph of this form via text message to the other realtor?
For what?
For the form where it says that they're getting the buyer's agent is getting compensation.
It doesn't matter what you send. It's what you all agree in writing. You're talking about the compensation agreement, not that
Correct.
addendum regarding
Correct.
broker's fees. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Anything, it is all going to be in writing. It's not going to bind the listing broker unless all parties have signed. And when does it get signed? It gets signed before the contract offer is done, and definitely before it's executed, because you're going to have to look at it very closely in light of the various things that can go on with the process being hurried and taking a lot of time. The big thing is, as listing agents, you really need to figure out how am I going to facilitate all this, right? What am I going to do? Could you send out emails to all the agents that you've done transactions with or that you have in your database and saying, I've got a great new listing and I cooperate with you? Can you do that?
Yes.
Absolutely. Could you put it on your sign? Call for,
Yes.
Yeah, you can. It's just you can't have it tied in any way, shape, or form through MLS, direct or indirect, down like a link or a feed. And what I've been seeing is that they're very aware that there are agents that have their various groups, and they've decided they're going to have a secret language that they're going to put a certain symbol or a code in agent remarks. Good luck, folks. You're in violation of the NAR settlement. You will
And you
not.
guys, the fine stuff,
Yeah.
it goes to the broker and it goes to the agent, and there is no redemption period. They just do it. So we're not going to do any of that nonsense. But the but the idea of having an MLS set up, let me take that jargon out, of having a database set up specifically for this. Eventually, if you all put your listings in there, consumers are going to know, or other agents are going to know, hey, I don't want to mess around with trying to get in, heaven forbid, contact with the agent. Here, it's going to be right there for you. Putting it on your sign helps too, but the majority of other agents don't find your property through a yard sign. Consumer does, but other agents don't. They find it through some sort of database. In this case, it's MLS. So let's be prepared and start using this site that we've had ready to go for you guys for the last couple months.
It's a great alternative, and it complies with NAR settlement. You couldn't ask for a better
tell what the
combination.
address is for that site?
I have a question just in case, because I know that people can be smart-ish. What if we have in front of the house, we have a sign and it says we pay compensation to buyer agent 3%, and it happens to be on the pictures that are on the MLS. That's bad idea, right?
Nope, couldn't have the picture on MLS with the sign if you're going to have any compensation on the sign.
Marilyn, this is Melanie Pippery. Hi. Is
Hi.
it okay if we leave this form inside the home for the agent to pick up when they're showing their buyer?
I would think that's an excellent idea, because that is not a direct or indirect to the MLS feed. You're able to do that. You're able to
Yeah,
put
just
it on
leave
your
it there and let them
website.
pick it up.
Right. Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was awesome, Melanie.
Marilyn,
as
I've
I-
got a question.
Uh-huh.
This is Marcia. So, you know, I am just thinking, I'm showing 8 to 10 houses. I don't even know if my buyers will like the home. Yet I'm thinking that I have to get whatever the form number is of the 2402 over to them and back before I even show them the house.
No, you don't have to do that.
No, but I mean, it seems a little insane because, I mean, you know, they may not even like the house.
Yeah, that's true. They may not. And I think per your buyer tenant agreement, prior to them making an offer, they have to know this information. So it's
Yes,
really just prior to making an offer.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
If a buyer is paying your commission, how does that get paid? Or will we find that out on the next?
Well, I'm just going to tell you that the escrow officer at the title company is going to receive a copy of your signed buyer tenant agreement authorizing that.
Marilyn, would you repeat what you just said?
Yeah, would you ask the question again?
She's asking if the buyer is paying the compensation for the buyer brokerage, how will she get paid? I said, well, you're going to provide a copy of the buyer tenant agreement showing that your buyer is paying it so that title can take the funds from your buyer and give them to KW on the settlement statement.
I'm sorry, is that a buyer's representation?
The buyer's tenant agreement. Yeah, the thing you have to have before you show properties.
So Marilyn, this just makes it all that much more important for all of us to give feedback to TREC for the ratification of fee to be added to the contract.
Yeah, they were real hesitant in that meeting and I listened to it all darn day long. They spent 3 hours
It
on
would
something that was stupid.
It would simplify communication between everyone.
I know. And they talked about the ratification in the farm and ranch contract quite a bit. And now they're thinking that there are issues with it because it's not a part of the contract. It's signed outside of the contract and all these legal things. So they're not going to do anything. They took a wait and see attitude with the addendum regarding brokers fees that Texas Realtors has. And they are changing 12A1A and B to identify what the seller's expenses will be. They're paying their brokerage fees, as well as what is going to be identified based on the buyer's expenses. And they're going to have probably 2 fields, what they talked about. One, where the seller will give X number of dollars towards the buyer's expenses, which includes brokerage fees and then all others. So they're in the midst of trying to do all of this in 12 and take care of it, but they're not considering at this point in time a ratification or an addendum. But yeah, as I said, TREC Broker Lawyer Committee will be sending things to the TREC commissioners. Their meeting is on August 19th. And so what you'll want to do is after August 19th, I'll be visiting with you and letting you know this is the comment period. These are the changes that are proposed. And please add your comments so that the Broker Lawyer Committee will see all those in October when they meet before the November TREC meeting. They're not going to solve this for us, folks. And you know, half of the Broker Lawyer Committee or brokers and the others are lawyers. And some of those attorneys are brokers as well. Ron Walker, he's been around for a long time. I've known him a long time. And they understand how the transactions are facilitated. That's the real key. That's the crux of why I mentioned listing agents be prepared, because you know all sorts of stuff is going to come at you and you're going to have to look at it through the prism of make sure you go through this and make sure everything is done in accordance with your listing agreement that your seller has agreed, right? And again, you just have to be prepared because I know all sorts of things are going to be done.
It feels like there's a lot of traps set up for us. It feels less transparent and like a whole lot more work.
That's what they all talked about, the transparency. TREC is a consumer protection agency, and they all think that the comments from various individuals is that you're not making this more transparent. It's more confusing for the parties, truthfully. And you know, we were not, our listing agreements were the same, basically. They just now identified it differently in a box. And so the same provisions have always been there. But based on that settlement and NAR making those changes in MLS, those types of things, it really has caused us to pause. Not only the listing agent side is not as complex and to facilitate as the buyer agent side. I think that's a little bit more cumbersome and knowing the process exactly so that everything fits into place. But listing agents, you've got to be prepared because you know all sorts of stuff is going to come your way. Is it happy hour yet?
It is.
We're already drinking, Marilyn.
You're the greatest, Marilyn.
Where I'm going to drink tonight.
All right,
Even lemonade sounds good.
I've had a few texts. This is being recorded, guys. So you get to watch all this nonsense later. But we're so grateful that Marilyn's taken the time to do this. And I know it's still very confusing. I've had a number of people say that this is definitely not enough of an explanation. We're going to need to fill this out. Remember, in the early stages, it's going to be a little funky, and we're going to have plenty of people that have had no preparation. If you think about it, we've got about 170 people on this, but we have 550 agents. So what's going to happen with this other 400? And it's going to be the same thing in every office. So there's going to be a lot of frustration that happens in the early stages. I'm just asking that we do it right. We set the example in this office, and we will not try to circumvent this ridiculous thing that passed, but we're gonna do what we need to do to get through this. Okay.
Sounds like a plan. All right, everybody, please take care. See you next time.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you, Marilyn.
And Marilyn, when do we see you again? You mentioned the 14th.
August 14th, we're going to do buyers.
Okay, but then will we talk with you on the 29th?
Of August?
Of July?
No, this is in place of the July 29th. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So even though I'm on the moon on the 14th, I will be back here.
Good. Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thank you, Marilyn, as always.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Bye-bye.
A pleasure.
Bye, Marilyn.
Bye-bye.
Hey, well.